It's sort of regressive as a sort of fantasy of his childhood and the magic of the transistor radio and the land to which he travels through hearing this music on the airwaves. So it does seem to sort of hanker for some magical time in his memory that he can't really access anymore. It's pretty sad rather than magical.
Dancing back and forth, the magic transistor started moving down his path. He could hear the sound coming out like nothing he had ever heard before.
It's odd. It was not something that was designed or ever could have been commercially successful. It was very long. I think it would have taken up most of a side of an album, if not the entire side. It was an eccentric work from an eccentric guy describing his eccentric life. So on one level, it's hugely successful. On another level, it can't exist on a rock and roll record in 1973.
And that record, on which the other members of the Beach Boys continued to grow as songwriters and performers, proved a notable success, hitting the US top 40 and remaining in the charts for 7 months.
I don't think Holland is vastly superior to Carl and the Passions, but it probably is a better record, kind of track for track. I think it is definitely an album that suggests maturity, regardless of the agendas of each of them and the internal politics. You know, they do pull together, they take the music seriously. You know, they're not just hacking it, they want to make a great album.
Making it softly, like the evening sea, trying to be, making it go, creating it gently.
Holland is oddly the least Brian Wilson album that they have, and one of my favorites. These are the works of the other Beach Boys to a great degree, to some extent working along the lines of what Brian had created, but to I think a bigger extent, being themselves and writing about their lives and their experiences and using their own distinct sort of sounds and influences. And it was hugely satisfying for a time. I mean, Holland was, in Rolling Stone magazine, I remember, it was just, wonderfully reviewed as one of their better albums.
Yet once again, Warner Reprise had been dissatisfied with the original master when it was delivered. And Sail on Sailor, a track that Van Dyke Parks had composed with Brian Wilson back in May 1972, was resurrected and recorded. It became the album's lead single, and its lyrics showed a strain of optimism absent from Wilson's recent work.
The reason why I think Sail on Sailor is an even more important song for Brian Wilson than Till I Die is the despair and hopelessness and just, I want to get away from it all and out, that Till I Die is about, is then a new birth with Sail on Sailor, because I'm going to continue, I'm going to deal. Like the lyrics of Sail on Sailor go on about rebirth and rediscovery and just getting through those hard times and then coming out of it. When Brian Wilson did the Smile Tour in 2004, he did Sail on Sailor, and he totally reclaimed the song as he reclaimed the Smile album. And it was kind of an amazing thing for all of us to look around and say, he's actually singing this, and he's saying all the words, and he knows those words, and he feels those words. That's why that's such an important song, because he's going to carry on. This guy outlived Dennis, he outlived Murray, he outlived Carl, he outlived the entire Jimi Hendrix experience who said surf music is dead. Sail on Sailor shows where Brian's personality really was. He was going to survive.
In 1973, however, that was far from obvious. In June, Murray Wilson passed away, and losing the volatile anchor that was both damaging and stabilizing, Brian spiraled out of control. First fleeing to New York and avoiding the funeral, by the end of the month the composer returned to his Bel Air home and retired to his bed, where he would remain on and off for the next 2 years. Cast adrift from his old band, and without any new projects to focus on, Brian Wilson disappeared from public life. The Beach Boys, on the other hand, were about to see their fortunes change. Popular culture had reached a turning point, and with America exhausted by the disaster of the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal and failed revolutionary politics, a new wave of nostalgia swept across the nation. Heralded by the release of George Lucas's hit film American Graffiti, which painted an idealized romantic image of early 60s youth culture, this collective yearning for a more innocent time hugely benefited the Beach Boys, whose early work exemplified this era. Capitol Records were quick to notice this new trend, and Rush released a cleverly compiled best-of album, Endless Summer, in 1974. A selection of the band's material from 62 to 65, it sold more than 1 million copies and elevated the Beach Boys to a popularity they had hardly known in their heyday.
There's no doubt the compilations were helped by a huge undertow of nostalgia and recycling and return to pre-psychedelic, pre-experimental pop innocence, if you like. You know, it's the days of hot hamburger stands and milkshakes and drive-ins and everything that American Graffiti represented. Very important, and everybody's going back to that. It's certainly not just the Beach Boys. Endless Summer, I suppose ultimately it vindicated the Mike Love camp. It said, you know, come on guys, let's just be pragmatic here. Let's not fuck with the formula. The formula is that the people want those old hits. They want to hear them in the summer fairgrounds, and they want to hear them in the arenas and the bowls, and that's what they want.
The fact that this Beach Boys early music makes its comeback via the Endless Summer just changes the whole picture. And the band starts to do a set list that basically remained until this day. I think, you know, how does it, the concert starts out with California Girls, it ends with Surfing USA, they come back with Good Vibrations for the encore and Barbara Ann, and finally end with Fun, 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 whoopee, we're home, you know, instead of doing Riot on Cell Block number 9 and Student Demonstration Time, you know. It just becomes a completely different thing. It just changes overnight.
The trajectory that had seen the band free themselves from their past and establish a more modest fan base with the mature sounds of Carl and the Passions and Holland was at an end. Jack Riley was sacked, Blondie Chaplin and Ricky Fattar soon left the band, and the focus was on capitalizing on the new nostalgia audience. In 1975, the band toured relentlessly, while further compilations hit the shelves. Yet the composer who had written the majority of the classics that audiences wanted to hear was nowhere to be seen. By this time, Brian Wilson was a changed man, mentally and now physically, the years of fast food, drugs and inactivity having visibly taken their toll. Finally, in late '75, a radical therapist, Dr. Eugene Landy, was called in to bring Brian Wilson back to the land of the living.
I don't think they were really in a position, one way or the other, to really want to acknowledge that he had some mental problems. A lot of people, and I think particularly from their background, are very determined to not do that, because at which point you begin to admit something very scary and something that's very stigmatizing. But he was really not well, and in order to try to make him well, that's when his wife Marilyn, a long-suffering wife, by the way, she hired this psychologist, Gene Landy, who was, suspiciously enough, very tied in, you know, to showbiz people. But he had a very strict kind of fascistic style of practice where you just you take these people and you essentially reparent them. And people who have drug habits, people who have antisocial habits, usually these things come together. High-functioning, super successful weirdos that you take and kind of raise into functional creative people. He sort of became the anchor that Brian had with his father in his life, telling him to get up off his ass and do his work. And Brian kind of needs that. And I think that once he developed a little motivation, a little momentum, and sort of the new bounds of his life were sort of created for him, he could work.
By 1976, Wilson was showing signs of improvement under Landy's regime. Not only was he out of bed and exercising, but he was also starting to write songs again at the therapist's insistence. This presented an opportunity for the Beach Boys, as Warner Reprise were desperate to see Brian involved in the band's next album, despite work already completed by the other Wilson brothers.
Dennis and Carl had worked for a full 2 years probably, most days that they had free, working on albums and trying to get the best possible Beach Boy songs that they could, and it wouldn't fly without Brian's name on it. I mean, I heard that literally from business people, you know, until you get Brian in there, it's not going to happen, you know. And then, you know, it doesn't matter what terrible song it would be, that would be the single, and that would be, you know, the sales point, Brian's back, you know. So they had to do whatever they could to get Brian in the studio to do something. They managed to get Brian and the various people from the Wrecking Crew and so on, and from Universal Audio over to record with Brian. And finally did it, you know, finally got it together to do the 15 Big Ones albums.
The sort of scheme they came up with was this great sort of Brian is back mythos, this idea that Brian Wilson, after all these years, has finally gotten up, he's ready to work, he's going to produce an album for us. So this guy who produced and wrote all those great hits that you just bought in mass quantity with Endless Summer is producing, writing and producing, you know, work that you can now, new work that you can now buy in mass quantities. And not only that, he's going to be a performing, functioning member of this band.
A 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3, go!
I've stayed off the drugs and come back into my own. And between my wife, the doctors, and my brothers, and my mother, and a couple friends, they all convinced me to get out of my room, get back in there in the studio, and get to work.
I won't say that Brian wasn't nervous on the 15 Big Ones album, because that's, you know, Brian is back, but Brian doesn't want to be back, it might be the catchphrase for that album. And so even though all the people in the room were his friends from the old days, he just couldn't wait to get out of the room. He wasn't ready to come into the studio, but I suspect that if you left him alone and waited for him to get ready, he would never get ready, you know. So he needed a push. So he seemed uncomfortable, not because he wasn't used to what you do in a studio, but just because he was out and away from his bedroom. That was frightening to Brian, I truly believe. And, you know, but getting him into Brothers Studio, even with the only 2 or 3 very friendly people around him, he was still very nervous to deal with people that he didn't know. So that went slowly, but when it came to actually recording, that was, in a way, I believe, his refuge. He could sit down at the piano and play comfortably. He could even be in front of the console and mixing comfortably. He knew exactly how he had done it, and he knew just how to do it. And the more times he stuck to his regimen, the more things got done.
The music that Brian was interested in working on was a source of conflict, however. Despite the wealth of new material he'd been writing under Landy's instruction, he was less comfortable developing these tracks, and instead chose to feel his way back into the recording process by producing versions of rock and roll standards. Sessions broke down more than once, with the other Wilson brothers adamant that the original songs were far more vital. And in the end, the album 15 Big Ones was a compromise, a mixture of covers and new compositions. Despite a tepid critical reception, the first new Beach Boys LP in 3 years was their biggest seller since the mid-60s.
15 Big Ones was promoted bigger than any Beach Boy record had been for a long time. If it had been a real Beach Boy album, it would have been, I would have been happy. It would have been wonderful. If it had had that type of promotion, I think the Beach Boys, if they hadn't gone back on top, they would be at least up to the level of all the other, you know, popular bands. But, you know, it was just an album full of oldies that, you know, Brian tossed out. And so the fact that it sold well, I think, meant that the songs weren't offensive and that the promotion was incredible.
I don't have much against unless they try to play it through. And who's the beauty of the man?